The Marianas are a 250-kilometer-long arc of volcanic outcroppings, coral reefs, and atolls in the western Pacific. Strung between Guam in the south and the closely nestled Saipan and Tinian in the north, the chain of 15 islands is one of the most geographically remote spots on the planet. To the south, west, and north, the nearest land masses, much more substantial than glorified sandbars or guano-encrusted rock piles, are the Indonesian, Philippine, and Japanese archipelagos, respectively, each well over 2,000 kilometers distant. To the east, one must travel to the Hawaiian Islands, a journey of over 5,000 kilometers, to find another piece of terra firma large enough for a sustainable human settlement like a fishing village, a taro farm, or an airfield for heavy bombers. The archipelago was first settled by human beings some 3,500 years ago, when a band of Polynesians made one of the longest open canoe ocean crossings in history, navigating by stars, currents, and seabird migrations to reach their new home. At least that's what Jared Diamond says. Over a span of some 3,000 culturally unmolested years, the descendants of those ancient mariners went on to establish what would become the Chamorro civilization. But the writing appeared on the wall for the Chamorro's Pacific paradise when it was discovered in 1521 by a Spanish expedition under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, whose initial encounter with the light-fingered inhabitants of one of the Chamorro Islands incensed him enough to kill 7 of their number in a punitive raid on their village, and to dub his newest contribution to Western cartographical knowledge, most likely with no sense of irony whatsoever, Las Islas de Ladrones, the Islands of Thieves. After setting off in a huff for points west after that, the short-tempered explorer's streak of interculturally tone-deaf Pacific overtures ended just 6 weeks later when he was speared in the face and hacked to death with bolo swords by indigenous warriors on the island of Mactan in what would become the Spanish colony of the Philippines some 40 years later. The flag-planting precedent of Magellan's unhappy early 16th century visit to the region was cited when another flotilla of galleons returned to formally claim the Islands of Thieves as a Spanish colony in 1667. Facing no significant opposition either from European rivals or local residents, the new rulers of the territory established headquarters on Guam and, rebranding the Islands of Thieves in favor of something more genteel and investor-friendly, named their colony after Mariana, the Habsburg Queen Regent of Spain at the time. The archipelago remained a colony of Spain until 1899, when the former globe-dominating power, now cash-strapped and reeling from its recent military defeat by imperialist up-and-comer America, ceded Guam to its victorious adversary and sold Saipan, Tinian, and the rest of the other so-called Northern Marianas to Imperial Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, right? Less than 20 years later, German colonial rule came to a sudden end when the Northern Marianas were seized and claimed during World War I by then Allied combatant Japan. Finding the territory's traditional economic basis in small-scale farming and animal husbandry not to their liking, the new colonial administrators promptly covered the islands in cane fields instead. Local Chamorros were hired and large numbers of Korean laborers were imported to work the crops and mills under the supervision of Japanese executives and technicians. And when the colonists were not exporting their cheap sugar back to the Japanese home market, they were keeping a wary eye on their American neighbors in Guam and, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, constructing naval facilities and military fortifications for the North Marianas' role as a key outpost on the western frontier of the Japanese Empire. On December 8th, 1941, simultaneous with much larger Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor to the east, on the December 7th side of the international dateline, the Philippines to the west, and other American, British, and Dutch garrisons across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, a Japanese force of some 6,000 elite amphibious troops, supported by a flotilla of cruisers and destroyers, assaulted Guam. After a 2-day battle with its 500-odd American defenders, the Japanese received the island's surrender from its American naval governor. With Guam now secured, Japanese possession of the Marianas was now complete. The archipelago became a central citadel in the empire's westernmost line of defense, a line that would soon stretch from the Alaskan Aleutian Islands in the northern hemisphere to the Solomon Islands south of the equator. And for the next 2.5 years, until American forces under Admiral Chester Nimitz returned to vie for control of the region, the Western Pacific would be a Japanese lake. Now, Japan was not the first seagoing great power to appreciate the Marianas' strategic value. Since the days when Spanish galleons really plied a route between the Philippines and Acapulco, the islands were coveted as bases from which to project naval and later air power across important Pacific Ocean sea lanes. But what put the archipelago most urgently in the sights of American war planners in the spring of 1944 was not such an orthodox assessment of its value as a sea lane straddling naval outpost or a refueling spot for flying boats. Rather, it was the recent rollout of the newest heavy bomber in the arsenal of the U.S. Army Air Force, USAF, the Boeing B-29. With its huge bomb-carrying capacity and unprecedented flying range, which would be respectable even in a mid-sized jet airliner today, the B-29 presented American strategists with a golden opportunity to at long last take the war to Japan via strategic bombing of its war industries in the home islands. But before the bomber could fulfill that promising potential, it required airfields that were, first of all, spacious enough for the 2,800 meter long runways fully loaded B-29s needed for takeoff, sufficiently distanced from large concentrations of Japanese military force to be secure from counterattack. That had been an Achilles heel in attempts to base American heavy bombers in China and India. And finally, they had to be close enough to Japan to make round-trip bombing operations feasible at the upper limits of the B-29's cruising range. In the spring of 1944, the Marianas were the only real estate in the Pacific theater meeting those requirements that presented any realistic prospect of falling into American hands anytime soon. The Americans made their move in June 1944, launching amphibious naval and air forces against Saipan. Yes, Lee Marvin was there. No, Captain Kangaroo was not. I digress. Ground troops encountered bitter resistance from the island's military defenders, whose tactics included banzai suicide charges in the closing phase of the fighting. For the first but not the last time in these Pacific Island battles, the Americans also encountered mass suicides on the part of the local Japanese civilian population, who had apparently been told to expect torture, rape, and massacre at the hands of the American invaders, and who subsequently panicked accordingly when the shooting started. In a grim coda to what eventually ground out into a 3-week-long bloody slog of a battle, war-hardened American infantrymen looked on in horror and disbelief as thousands of cornered Japanese civilians, often entire families of men, women, and children, took their own lives with hand grenades or by leaping from cliffs at spots like Marby Point, rather than take their chances with the island's new occupiers. Why should we expect American soldiers to treat us any differently than our own soldiers would treat enemy civilians in a reverse situation? Would have been a compelling argument for suicide from a Japanese perspective in this particular context, not necessarily so much out of some death before dishonor Bushido samurai ethos as from the simple fact that many of the colonists in Saipan would have been military veterans of ground combat themselves on the continent, with first-hand experience as boots-on-the-ground participants in the systemic brutality the emperor's soldiers had been meting out to civilian populations in China and Manchuria since the early 1930s. As these scenes of horror continued to unfold, and with bitter fighting still raging on the islands, U.S. Navy Seabees, which were naval construction battalions, went ashore, often under fire, to begin transforming first Saipan, then Guam and Tinian into what were, in effect, giant, unsinkable aircraft carriers for the round-the-clock launching and recovery of B-29s. Whenever possible, the Seabees sped up their work by incorporating and improving upon extant Japanese military and civilian/agricultural infrastructure, sugarcane fields, narrow-gauge railway beds, and warehouse depots became airfields or barracks complexes, supply roads, and bomb dumps virtually overnight. Modestly sized Japanese airfields were widened and lengthened, and new runways and hard stands, think of it as a parking spot, for hundreds of the huge bombers were leveled and paved by the Seabees' iconic Navy-grade bulldozers and steamrollers. Work continued at a furious pace through the rest of the summer and early fall of 1944 to get the airfields and facilities ready for the arrival of 21 bombing commands, that's Roman numerals XX1, 21 bombing commands, first B-29s on the islands the following October.